As I have said, the subject, act and will to victory. Act and will to victory. Realize one thing, that will is the motivating force of all creation. God created this universe. How? By the use of His will. All things are the result of will. Your success in any line of endeavor, from self-realization to the most worldly occupation and fulfillment of desire, depends upon will. Will is the key. Will is that which triggers action and also brings success. You have seen many cases of people who go into business. Many do not succeed because they do not have the right will to carry it through. But also you have seen many people who have the will. They have the will. They're energetic. They're filled with enthusiasm and determination. They do not succeed. Why? That's the important thing. That's just as important, perhaps, as will. And what is that? It is that you'll be guided rightly. That you'll do the right thing. That's very important. Just as important as will. Because if you are not headed in the right direction, so to speak, if you are not being guided rightly, even though you have a tremendous will, success will not come, except after long, long, long trial. I know down in Encinitas and along Highway 101, I see many motels, and every once in a while I see it change hands. Somebody enters with great enthusiasm, but they do not succeed. Why? Because they did not have the right guidance when they took that over. Many, as I have said, have the will, but you've got to have the guidance of God to succeed. In any business, you must have the right guidance to succeed. In any line. As I have said, from the highest of knowing God, especially, you must have the right guidance, even to the most ordinary business or occupation. And so it behooves us to realize those two things, that we must not only have will, but we must have the right guidance in using that will. You think of your own case and perhaps other cases. As you started out in life, probably somebody wanted you to do this thing or do that. They wanted me to be a music teacher. But I guess I'd have got by. But I'm sure that wouldn't have been the right guidance, because I wouldn't be satisfied to play a little bit, fool around and teach people. So we must have the right guidance. That I knew myself without even asking God. And of course God is in me. I guess He told me and saved me lots of trouble. So realize this guidance is very important. Then use your will coupled with God's will. And so in this subject, act and will to victory, what is victory? What is victory? What does that mean to you? Victory means overcoming an enemy, doesn't it? And victory means finally to once more regain and realize our divinity. That's taking victory in the highest sense. In ordinary life it means successful business and other things. But I think this morning it means victory. To once more know that we are God's immortal children and to reclaim our divinity. To know that that's victory. Now, victory means overcoming some desire. Because desire, or desire in general, because desire is the enemy. If you're going to have a victory, you must overcome some enemy, and that enemy is desire. There is no question about that. And so we must watch our desires. We must realize that our desires must be right. And if they are not right, we must overcome them. Because desire is our greatest enemy, and we cannot ever hope to have victory, more especially realize our divinity, until we overcome the enemy desire. That's very important. And as long as you have desires for outward things and put them ahead of things of God, you will not succeed, because you cannot contact God when you're filled with desires for outward things. And so this enemy we must know about before we go on with the subject desire. And in the Bhagavad Gita, we read these words. It is desire, begotten of motion, all-consuming, all-polluting. Know thou this as our foe here on earth. As a flame is enveloped by smoke, as a mirror by dust, so this eternal consciousness of God in us as our divinity is enveloped by desire. Enveloped is wisdom, which is the same as God's presence in us, by this constant enemy of the wise in the form of desire, which is insatiable as a flame. Therefore, O thou Arjuna, mastering first the senses, do thou slay this thing of sin, destructive of wisdom and knowledge. So realize that's what we must do. If you're going to will an act of victory, you've got to slay this thing, desire. Because as long as desire is in you, you will be attached to outward consciousness, and victory is not attained in outward worldly consciousness. Victory is within, in the intuition of the soul. So it's very important before we start to know the greatest enemy which stands in our way to victory is desire. Therefore, have one desire. You know what that is? You all know. To know God. Let that be back of all your activities, is to know God. And there's a reason. And the reason is this. We come to action or acting. Action which takes us to victory must be the right action. Action must be guided by soul, not outward consciousness. And if you are filled with desires, your action will not be guided by soul consciousness. It'll be guided by worldly consciousness, which does not give us final victory. The Master has said in his perception, Heavenly Father, I will reason, I will, I will act, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity to do the right thing that I should do. Now you can see action is very important in victory, but it must be right action. And therefore, our first necessity in carrying out our plan for victory is to know God, to make the contact with God, and before we start any project or action, get the contact of God at this point. See your wonders with Him. Ask Him, as the Master says, guide thou me to do the right thing. Now, if those people who bought those motels had done that, I know many of them would not have bought those hotels. Because God is mindful of His own. And He will not allow you to fail if you have confidence enough in Him to first get His contact. First know Him. Then your action will be right. Most people, as you know, act as automatons. They are guided by what? Environment, habit, latent impulses. We've been all over this before. Ordinary people, as Master used to say, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Good time, go to sleep, get up and do the same thing over and over. Aren't they automatons? Is that action guided by the soul? Well, I don't think it is. Because in that getting up and breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they're filled with so many desires, there's no end to it. So that even now they haven't got any bank account left. There's so many bills outstanding, and they're buying this, that, and the other thing, and a million things. So there's nothing left but, we get by somehow. But that's not real action. Real action is to secure. First thing we must do now, realize in acting and willing to victory, is to secure the guidance of God through God contact. And then, having that, we must perform the second thing, which is the use of will. These are very important things. And so most people, as I have said, act automatically by these, being influenced by these three things: environment, habit, latent impulses. That's what they think they exercise free will. They're going to do what they like. They're going to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But they have it because of the impulse behind them. So they don't do as they like. That's automatic action. And they have cottage cheese sometimes. Cottage cheese, then the whole thing is complete. But the right action is soul action, not automatic action. When you sit down, and this is very important, make contact with God. Listen, you can't go wrong. I remember I was out in the storm, as I've told you many times. Master used to like to have me tell the story. I won't go into it, but I was out in the storm, and it seemed hopeless, and I remembered his words. When you're in the Om vibration, nothing can touch you. And I looked there, and boy, I was ready to look. At least I had that sense. And then I felt in my heart a great pang. That's what moves God. I could have looked there all night. I don't think he'd have moved. But I felt in my heart a great desire for his guidance. And then the Master knew of it. And to make a long story short, I was saved. And the Master knew all about it. Why? Because I had contacted the place of the Most High at this point. And Master, being one with the great omniscience of God, knew it. And things worked out, and I was saved. He knew it in the instant. Later I had proof of it. And so you see, the most important thing is to perform independent action whereby you contact the soul within. Contacting the soul, which is God in us. We must come out right. And so independent action must be utilized as we travel this road to ultimate victory, which is the goal of life, our oneness with God, and the realization of our divinity. We can be successful in life, in the arts and in business, but if you don't have God, it isn't success. The Master used to say you can be unsuccessful in anything. But if you have God, if you attain success in knowing Him, whether you're a success or failure in the ordinary sense of the world, you are the greatest success if God is with you. Realize that. Realize these things, these immortal words of the Master. And so, action is very important. Right action as we use our will to victory. Now that brings us to the question of will. Will. There are all kinds of will. We see the first show of will in the little child called physiological will when it begins to howl. When he wakes up and howls, he wants his will. That's physiological will. Then we find also the explosive will of youth. And you see the results. I came up this morning and I saw the results of 3 wrecks on the way up. Why? Well, I won't say they were all perhaps from the explosive will of youth, but I can wager some were due to that. The explosive will is tremendous, but it isn't guided, don't you see? The explosive will of youth is tremendous, but sometimes it ends up in a telegraph pole or against another car. Why? Because there's not that guidance of God. But after many smash-ups, so to speak, and failures, this explosive will becomes thinking will. They begin to think it over after they've got broken up and lots of trouble. Then you begin to think. That's thinking will. That's very good. But of course that is not enough. Thinking will, with thinking will, when we think things out, we'll have less trouble. But unless you have God's contact, you cannot see beneath the ordinary flow of events into His great plan. And so we are sidetracked. Thinking will is better, but it is not enough. Now the will that's important is steady will. Realize that. Steady will. And when you go to school, you've got to use steady will to succeed. You've got to apply that steady will in everything you do until you graduate. In business, if you start a business and the will is not steady, you may start off good, but unless you follow through with steady will, you will not succeed. Steady will means that steady application of the power of God in you as will until consummation. That's very important. And realize this one thing. Steady will, which means divine will, is very important, because with steady will, certain vibrations are set up in the omniscience of God which give you success. That's a very important thing. Certain vibrations are set up in the omniscient presence of God, in which is His power and will, success. And all things that you do are controlled by steady will plus the consciousness of God. Realize that one thing, forget everything else I've said. Realize that, please, that everything you do, everything that you do or will do depends upon, I mean real things you do. Real victory depends upon steady will. Steady will plus the consciousness that God is with you. How can you fail? And that kind of will brings us to wisdom-guided will or divine will. You see how easy it is. In wisdom-guided will, what do? Knowing God, being one with His consciousness, don't you see that you join your will with God's will? And then it becomes divine will, wisdom-guided will. Now, when you apply that steady will, steady wisdom-guided will, you're bound to succeed, because that's the will of God. That's what people don't realize. Whenever you do whatever part you're playing in life, and you do it, joined with God's consciousness and keep the steady will flowing, aren't you doing the will of God? That's why it's so important. That's why it's called dynamic will or divine will. Dynamic will means a wisdom-guided will which knows no stopping, no compromise until success comes. And when your will is joined with God's will, and you know that your consciousness is one with God's consciousness, that's dynamic, divine will. And that must succeed, and that must give you the victory. Master has said these words: when you are strongly willing by steady divine will, this is so important. When you are strongly willing by steady divine will, those in tune out of the multitude, human beings, realize, those in tune out of the multitude will fulfill your desire. There'll be somebody come to fulfill that desire, because God is in everyone, and His omniscience is in everyone. And if you use this steady, as the Master calls it, steady divine will, there are those out of the multitude of human beings in tune with God who will unknowingly come and help you toward fulfillment. Isn't that wonderful? Well, if God knows the sparrows fall, and if He knows every hair of my head and your head, surely He can grant our simple wish. Yes, the Master says this: God answers even our slightest wish. In that state, when your will is coupled to God's will, realize that. When you are one with His consciousness, and divine will is flowing through you, don't you see you're doing the will of God, and everything you ask will be granted. That's the most wonderful thing that the Master has said. But it presupposes that we know God. That's the point. And so, in this subject, acting and willing to victory, use the right will. Use the wisdom-guided will, or God's will in you, by first making God's contact, and then keeping on, knowing no turning back. Why should you turn back if God's with you? Perhaps He wants you to take a little longer. What of it? God is with us. Who can be against us? And so realize this wonderful thing. And so, in conclusion, willing and acting to victory. Now, the victory is, as I have said, to regain our divinity. To realize that it's God in us. And if you can realize that, it takes away a great responsibility. You don't feel pushed in this way and that way, because you know God is the doer. And if you act being one with Him, you know it must be His will, and if it's His will, what comes is all right. If God is with us, what do we care? Nothing. And so victory means that. Victory means regaining our divinity, our immortality. Now the first and perhaps the greatest thing, if you're going to act and will to victory, is to be calm. Attain calmness. So many minds are restless all over the place. You must be calm. All the saints say, and a master started in many years ago on me, and he says, never lose your calmness. Never lose your calmness. All the saints say, never lose your calmness. That's a very important thing. If you are calm and feel that calmness within you, you can get God contact. But if you're restless, how can poor God get in? You can't get in. And so the first thing is to retain your calmness. As the Master said, we must be able to stand unshaken through the crash of breaking words. You don't understand? Listen, you can do it if He's with you. If you see His consciousness is light at this point, and know His consciousness is your own consciousness, and this body is His dream, you can stand unshaken through the crash of breaking worlds. But you can only do it if God is with you. And so the first thing in attaining victory is to retain our calmness. This is the first unalterable rule. Now, the second thing is to will at this point. You must have a definite procedure. If you're willing with your mind and your powers diluted, distracted, you cannot succeed. But if you will at this point, and your consciousness is one with God, don't you see you have the tremendous force of God's will at this point? That's where you contact it. As the Master said, 1,000,000 volts are at your disposal, at the will center. That's why Jesus said, I could, if I wanted to, command many angels to come and destroy my enemy. Master said the same thing, and I've seen Him do it once or twice. Why? Because God's tremendous will is at this point. And, as He has said, 1,000,000 volts are available for you if you contact and work at the Christ Center, not with your limited intellect and with limited human will. You must join your will with God's will at the Christ Center. That's the second step. And now, remember that God's will, if it is your will, is the supreme power in the universe. All things have been created by God through His will. All things, universe upon universe, by will. And so, if we are to win this victory of realizing our oneness with God, we have to use our will. We have to use our will to discipline ourselves. That's what we don't do. We get all enthused at this meeting, and it peters out. You must discipline yourself. How? By concentration, meditation, and communion. And you have the method. You have the ways of Master. He has given you the ways and the means, the techniques even. He's written them all out for you. Now do them. Use your will to do that. You understand? Use your will. Use your dynamic divine will to make yourself do these things. That's what discipline is. That's spiritual discipline. Use that power of God in you, that divine will at the Christ Center. Utilize the 1,000,000 volts of which I have spoken. To do what? To practice discipline of concentration, meditation, and communion with God. If you do that, what happens? Then you attain mastery. Mastery over this body, this little physical being, and your own body of consciousness. You attain mastery. Then, attaining mastery, then you can regain your immortal nature. You can once more realize that there is no separation between God and me. And you can not only say, thou and I, never apart, you can say, with Lord Shankara, I am He. I am He. Blessed Spirit.